I've received a letter from Andrew Little seeking to debate under Standing Order 389 the news of a serious failure of financial management at the Ministry of Health in relation to a building project. The news of the Ministry's inability to fund the building project from within the cash reserves as projected is a particular case of recent occurrence. The upcoming annual review debate offers an opportunity to debate the performance of government departments. This issue could be debated at that time. I do note, however, that the Health Committee has already presented its report on the annual review of the Ministry of Health. The issue was not raised in the report and presumably the committee was not aware of it. The matter raised is a very serious one and the sum of money involved is significant. The Treasury has expressed concern at the governance and financial management of the Ministry and has stated that it does not have, quote, confidence that the failures that occurred around the project will not reoccur. Having carefully considered this application, I believe it requires the urgent attention of the House. I therefore call on Andrew Little to move that the House take note of an urgent matter of public importance.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Ministry of Health is one of the biggest spending ministries and departments in the government. So what happens with the Ministry of Health matters. That's why good oversight matters. That's why you need a Minister of Health who is focused on the job and a Minister of Finance who is not asleep at the wheel. Unfortunately, we cannot say of the present Minister of Health nor of the present Minister of Finance that they are not across their portfolios and the Minister of Finance is not asleep at the wheel. This has been an absolute and utter failure of oversight by those charged with the responsibility of that oversight. A $24 million project, a $24 million refit project, that is a big project in government. And yet the Ministry of Health, its officials, no doubt aided and abetted by the Minister, because the Minister would know this was going on, is somehow able to persuade Cabinet that they've got the funds to do this project when the funds don't exist. How, Mr Speaker, does that happen? How does that happen? And now we see the real consequence of this. $18 million of this, the cost of this project, has to be financed out of a now much hiked rental that the Ministry has to pay for its premises. $18 million more over 15 years. That means that its rental for its head office is now going to cost more than $1 million a year extra over the next 15 years. And we know who will pay the price for that. We know who will pay the price for that. It won't just be every taxpayer, it'll be the patients who yet again and for the next 15 years will go without the hospital surgery that they need, the pharmaceutical treatment that they need. That's what happens when ministers in this government are so arrogant and so contemptuous of their responsibilities as ministers. They just don't care. They just let it go. They let officials from the ministry tell them, don't worry, we got $24 million. And does the Minister of Finance tell his officials, tell the Secretary of Treasury, could you please just go and check the balance sheet? Just check that the reserves are there, please. Can you just check that they've got $24 million? No one did it. The Secretary of Treasury, aided and abetted by the Minister, of course kicks for touch, says no one came to us, no one told us, we're only the Treasury. How would we know about the money that the Ministry of Health says that it's got or that it needs? He doesn't know, the Minister of Finance doesn't know, the Minister of Health doesn't care, and no one knows what's going on. But it doesn't end there, because having got the entire Cabinet to approve the whole project without the money being there, they then delegated the responsibility of tying up the loose ends and making sure that it was all kosher to the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Health. This is what the Secretary of Treasury said. This is how he recorded it. He said, in approving the business case, Cabinet delegated responsibility to the Minister of Finance and the responsible agency minister to approve final investment decisions. It is very clear So in spite of the Prime Minister saying there is no issue here, there's nothing on the record, there is no evidence, there is nothing wrong, here is the documented evidence. Here is the documented evidence of ministerial incompetence and failure. They cannot do their jobs. And the one person who we need to know is doing their job is the Minister of Finance, spending billions of dollars, or at least overseeing the spending of billions of dollars, the raising of billions of dollars of taxes, and he does not care that a department, one of the biggest in the country, waltzes on up and says, leave the project to us, we've got $24 million, and he doesn't even care they've got it or not. That's our Minister of Finance. That's the New Zealand Minister of Finance today. Does not pay attention, does not give attention to detail, and lets this fiasco carry on. It gets worse. It gets worse. Because the Secretary for Treasury goes on to say, and I make no judgment at all about whether this is a self-serving document. It may or it may not be. I make no judgment. But this is what he goes on to say. He said the approval by Cabinet was on the basis that no additional Crown funding was required and that the $24 million capital investment would be funded from cash reserves. He goes on to say the Treasury was not consulted. How does it happen? How does it happen that a $24 million project can be given sign-off by Cabinet and Treasury doesn't know about it? Treasury does not know about it. Is that even possible? Is that even credible? Is it even believable? No, it's not. No, it's not. And they are desperately playing a dance to try and bury this and make it go away. Well, that's been the role of the Minister of Health, at least anyway. So when the disaster, when the fiasco became apparent, what do? Anybody else, any self-respecting minister concerned about his responsibilities and accountabilities to the taxpayer would have thought, gee, I better have a look at this, better call in the specialist, better call in the Auditor General, because they're the specialist agency that deals with mismanagement in the public sector, with failures of management responsibility. Better go to the Auditor General. But what does he do? Better not have anybody who can call us to account. We'll call in the private sector. Because according to the National Party, the private sector can do no wrong. That's why you sell Landcorp, or talk about it, at the behest of your junior party partner. So they call in PricewaterhouseCoopers, that does this skimpy little document that confirms what we all know just by looking at the details.
Don't tell us the cost.
They said there was serious financial management. Oh, yeah? $24 million that Cabinet approves, Treasury doesn't know about, the ministers don't care about. Well, we know that that's serious financial management. The question is, how on earth did that happen? How on earth did that happen? It is a disgrace, Mr. Speaker. It is an absolute disgrace. Because what the Secretary of Treasury then goes on to say in his most instructive memo, in his aide memoir, as he describes it, he says the whole issue has come to light in the 2015 budget process.
Who's responsible?
Because the ministry does not have sufficient cash reserves. But it goes on to say this, Mr. Speaker, it goes on to say this, nor did the ministry have sufficient forecast cash reserves when the property consolidation, which is the project they're talking about, was approved by ministers in 2014. So at the very time that the highly skilled National Party Cabinet, the masters of the universe, the great managers of the economy, the people who know everything about managing assets and capital and money, at the very time they were approving this, the Ministry of Health didn't even have the money. Didn't even have the money.
What kind of incompetence is that?
What sheer and utter incompetence is this? What sheer and utter incompetence? It is nothing less than a total disgrace.
He laughs.
And they laugh about it because that is the National Party of the 21st century. Arrogant, contemptuous, don't care about their responsibilities to the electorate, don't care about their accountabilities to the taxpayer. They just don't care. They just don't care. They went on to say, the Secretary of Treasury very helpfully went on to say that their next bid demanded the equivalent of 90% of the department's projected depreciation funding over the next 2 years, which of course was completely impossible because as it turns out, they've got other assets that they've got to depreciate, including an ICT system, which depreciates more rapidly. So they couldn't do it. And you know what the Ministry of Health then tried to do? They then tried to sort of inveigle their way in to the DHBs and say, forget about the DHBs for a moment. We might have an extra $200 million for their capital funding, but give it to us in Wellington, because we've made such a huge mistake that we should be rewarded for it at the expense of the DHBs around the rest of the country. And you know who the people are who I most pity in all of this? It's the people of Dunedin. The people of Dunedin who have been waiting for an upgrade to their hospital for years. I visited that hospital last year. It is literally falling down around your ears. Well, my ears, and they're pretty big, admittedly. The hospital is falling down around their ears. Leaks, people are jammed into it, people have to have surgery in cramped and barely spacious surgical theatres. They are waiting for their hospital upgrade. But they won't get it now, and it'll be pushed out because of the Minister of Health's incompetence, the Minister of Finance's failure. Will they ever front up to Dunedin, do you think? Will they ever go to Dunedin and explain to the people of Dunedin, sorry, we'd like to give you a new hospital. We can't, because we failed to do our basic job of overseeing the officials that we are responsible for. We are too busy scoring political points, playing political games, to care about what's actually happening in health, to care about what's happening with our hospitals. We'd rather just ignore the officials, ignore our job to check that when officials tell us money is there, that it is. We'd rather forget all that stuff because we're too busy playing political games and scoring political points. That's what this government has come down to. And now we have reached the apotheosis. Now we have reached the apotheosis of a government that for so long, for 8 years, has never taken responsibility for its own failures. Never taken responsibility for its own incompetence. Blame everybody else. It's everybody else's fault. I noticed how when the story broke, it wasn't the minister who fronted up in the Westminster tradition of ministerial responsibility. They shoved out the Director General, the newish Director General, former acting Director General, push him out there because he's the sacrificial lamb. Well, it's not just his fault. He may have some responsibility. He may have some responsibility, but it is the minister, ultimately, the ministers who are to blame. I'm going to turn Bob Semple's dictum on its head. They are not just responsible, but they are to blame. It was their job to make sure that their officials did their job. It was their job to ask the simple questions. So when you say you've got $24 million of reserves, because I say it does raise an obvious question. When a government department says they've got $24 million in reserves, if I was a minister, I'd be asking, really? How much underspending have you had to do in the health sector, which is so desperately needy of cash? How much underspending have you done and for how long that leaves you with $24 million reserves? That's an obvious question. And had the question been asked, had the ministers been doing their job, had they asked the question, it's pretty obvious, then they would have to have been told, oh, whoops, we don't have that money. And then the project wouldn't have been approved and we would not be in this situation.
That's right.
And none of us in the opposition likes to be in the position of pointing out to ministers how incompetent they are. That's not good government. It's not good government when we are in that position. But it behoves us on the side of the House. It is our moral responsibility when we see such a fiasco, such a farrago in public service management. We have to call this to account. And we have to tell every New Zealander, if you are wondering what's happened to your health dollar, if you are wondering why you can't get your melanoma drug treatment, if you are wondering why you cannot get your surgical treatment, your elective surgery, look no further than the Minister of Health and the Minister of Finance, who now have squandered $24 million, or at least $18 million over the next 15 years, that has to be tacked onto the Ministry of Health budget at the expense of New Zealand's long-suffering patients. And you know who's going to suffer most? Not just the people in Dunedin, but it will be the elderly. Because we know when it comes to health decisions and health rationing, it's always the elderly who suffer. They're the ones who miss out on the hip surgery and the knee surgery and those things that make life just a little more comfortable after a lifetime of paying their taxes. They're the people who will pay the cost of this. When ministers fail to do their job, And, Mr Speaker, it cannot go unnoticed, and it will not go unnoticed. And this House must notice that two of the most senior ministers, presided over by a Prime Minister who's been in the job for 8 years, that on this occasion, the New Zealand government, represented by the Cabinet, the National Party Cabinet, totally failed New Zealanders, totally failed taxpayers in New Zealand. This is not the quality of government we should expect. And after 8 years, you know, the training wheels are long gone. The training wheels are off this lot. They know how to run a government, or they should do. They know how to ask the questions, or they should have done. But they have got to the point now where 8 years on, they have such contempt, such arrogance, they no longer care anymore. They no longer care about doing a good job. They no longer care about doing their job as highly paid ministers, responsible for the public purse, responsible to the people of New Zealand. It is absolutely appalling. It is absolutely appalling. And now a project has been entered into. It is beyond the point of no return, and taxpayers will pick up the cost. Taxpayers will pick up the cost. And the Secretary of Treasury goes on to say, his recommendation was that no extra money be made available to the Ministry of Health to punish them for their failure. Well, it's not just the ministry and its management that should be punished, it's the ministers as well. They too have failed. They failed New Zealand. They failed every taxpayer in this country.